I thought I'd share my story. Not many people believe me when I tell it, but I like to get it off my chest whenever I can. When I was 23, I lived in a haunted apartment for a year. The landlord actually confirmed it was haunted while I was signing the lease, but I didn't believe her because, well, I didn't believe in ghosts. Until this experience changed everything. When I first toured the apartment, we went to the basement where the laundry was. As we walked down, I felt like someone was following us, and we heard footsteps. The landlord turned to me and asked, "Do you hear that?" I jokingly replied, "Maybe it's a ghost." But she looked at me dead in the eyes and said, "This place is haunted." I didn't take her seriously and signed the lease right there on top of the washing machine. We never figured out what those footsteps were or why it felt like someone was following us that day. It's important to note that this was an old New England building dating back to the 1900s and had served various purposes over the years, including being a hospital at one point. I didn't bother to look up any of this until after I moved out. So, when the time came to move in, from the very first week, every night at exactly 3 a.m., it sounded like a big, heavy man was ramming himself against my front door. Every single night. At first, it terrified me, but when I realized it was happening like clockwork without any other disturbances, I thought someone was messing with me or didn't want me there. After 2 weeks of this, I decided to stay up and wait by the door to catch whoever was behind it. I even had a bat ready, just in case. But the strange thing is, I never felt threatened in the apartment, just curious and confused. So I stayed up one night, and right at 3 a.m. I looked through the peephole, waiting to see who was messing with me. It's worth mentioning that I lived on the second floor, and the building was old and creaky. I could hear everyone walking up and down the hallway and stairs, but with this noise, there were no footsteps, just the bang. That night, nothing happened at 3 a.m. I waited and stared out the peephole, but there was nothing. After about 5 minutes, I gave up and started to walk away, but as soon as I took 3 steps from the door, boom, the bang happened again. It sounded like someone with a running start was slamming into my metal door. I rushed back to the peephole, but no one was there. After that, I gave up trying to figure it out and just accepted it. It never felt threatening after the initial shock. I even started to sleep through it, though I would still wake up right at 3 a.m. every night, almost as if on cue. As time went on, I started spending more time at home, especially during the pandemic when we were all working remotely. I then began to notice other strange things. I don't drink, smoke, or sleepwalk, yet some nights I'd go to bed and wake up to find all the kitchen cabinets and drawers wide open. I definitely didn't do that, and I barely use the kitchen as it is. If I had a camera back then, I would have set it up. I also avoided doing any laundry because the basement felt incredibly eerie, unlike the indifference I felt in my apartment. Whenever I went down there, I felt a strong sense of dread, like someone was watching me, and I couldn't bring myself to turn my back to the door while loading clothes. I once thought I saw a sickly-looking blonde man in overalls standing in the doorway, but when I blinked, he was gone. Remember, this was the same basement where I had signed the lease. The basement was creepy with an old boiler room and a bike room full of abandoned bicycles. Sometimes, I swore I saw old, flat tires spinning on their own. The atmosphere was so oppressive that I eventually stopped going down there altogether and did my laundry at my parents' house 30 minutes away. One time, I went down to find everyone's wet laundry spilled across the floor with all the washer doors thrown wide open. It could have been a crazy neighbor, but it didn't seem that way. It always felt threatening. The vision of that man in overalls was the final straw. We also had storage rooms in the basement, each with a lock that we had bought ourselves. One day, the cops came because someone had broken into all our storage units. The strange part was that all the locks were just open, with no signs of tampering or damage. It was as if they all popped open at once. Nothing was stolen, and the cops were completely baffled. Back in my apartment, things started to get weirder. My TV would randomly turn on and off throughout the day, even after I changed the batteries in the remote. I still have that TV, and it's never done that since. Items would go missing, only to be found in strange places months later, like a necklace showing up in the oven. Despite all this, I always felt safe in my unit, even though I couldn't bring myself to go into the basement. I eventually started dating someone and they began noticing things that I hadn't. They were a lighter sleeper than me and would wake up around 3 a.m. to see things on the coffee table slowly moving around, like candles being pushed from side to side. I'm a messy person, so I always thought I was the one moving them, but it was nice to know it wasn't me. One time, my unplugged record player clicked on, the power glowed and the pin was placed, and the record started turning with no sound. After that, my partner refused to stay over again. Throughout my lease, I often heard heavy footsteps from the apartment above me, usually after 3 a.m. I figured the tenant was an insomniac or had an odd work schedule. When it was time to move out, my landlord asked if I had any complaints. Since it was a family-owned property, she came in person to say goodbye. I have jokingly mentioned that the tenant above me had a heavy foot and an unusual sleep schedule. She looked at me, puzzled, and said, "No one's lived in that unit for 2 years. It has damage." I'd only been there for a year, so whose footsteps was I hearing? And then, it was finally time to move out. I've never had any experiences like that again. That year made me believe in spirits, ghosts, and the unexplainable. The feelings I had can't be easily explained and, well, I've already said too much. At the time, I was into crystals and things like that, and I believe they either protected me or invited the spirits in. I'm not sure which. To this day, I think there's an evil blonde male ghost in overalls haunting that basement. I had just graduated from the police academy, and this was one of the first calls I ever responded to. We received a frantic call from a woman who had woken up to find a man in her house. She had been screaming over the line to dispatch. When we arrived on the scene, the woman was standing by her vehicle with her baby in her arms and a kitchen knife by her side. She was visibly shaken, and she told us she had woken up from a nap on the couch and noticed the basement light was on. She said she never leaves that light on and always keeps the door locked to prevent her baby from falling down the steps. She explained that she went to the door, opened it, and saw a white male in a t-shirt standing at the bottom of the steps. At first, he just stood there, staring at her with a blank expression. Then, she said, he smiled from ear to ear, raised his hand, and turned off the light from the bottom of the steps. Panicked, she slammed the door, locked it, grabbed a knife and her baby, and called 911. We began sweeping the house. 2 officers went upstairs while my field training officer and I headed down to the basement. We found no one there. The only door leading outside was locked from the inside, and when we checked all the other doors, they were also locked. The only possible exit was the door the woman had just come through. We informed her of this, and she began screaming and crying, insisting, "No, he's still in there, he hasn't left the house." We conducted another sweep, but still found no sign of anyone or anything out of the ordinary. We reassured her, but she continued to freak out. Eventually, we escorted her inside to gather some belongings, and she left to stay at a motel for the night. Her husband had been working out of town. I patrolled the area frequently, and about a week later, I noticed a for sale sign on the house. Despite its age, they had recently renovated it and invested a lot of money into it. Even though we didn't find anything, to this day I still believe she saw something. I've been reading a lot of stories lately, and it got me thinking about some of my own paranormal experiences. One in particular stands out. It's not the most eventful story, but it's definitely one of the most viscerally horrifying things that's ever happened to me. Back in 2016, I was in a long-term relationship with a girl whose family lived in a small town in Connecticut. We'd been dating for a little over a year, and while I'd met her parents a few times, this was the first time we were actually driving down to stay at her childhood home. I was already a bit nervous about staying with her parents and making a good impression, but she assured me everything would be fine. The drive down was incredibly scenic, and the town itself had all the charm of a quaint colonial village. When we arrived, I was struck by how beautiful the house was, a 3-story old New England home perched on a hill overlooking a sprawling green yard. Our parents greeted us warmly and led us into an open foyer with a dark wooden staircase. The house, though clearly old, had a cozy, welcoming vibe with subtle modern touches from recent remodels. My ex mentioned we'd be sleeping in the guest room upstairs since her childhood bedroom only had a narrow single bed. But then she casually added that the house was sort of haunted, and that the guest room was where most of the ghostly activity happened. When I asked her to elaborate, she mentioned that her brother had experienced weird stuff in that room, but she didn't go into much detail. I could tell she was trying to downplay it, not wanting to freak me out. She did say, though, that everyone in her family had experienced something strange at some point while living there. For example, her dad once felt a strong hand grip his right shoulder from behind while he was alone remodeling the kitchen. He jumped out of his chair, only to find no one there. He's not a superstitious guy, but he told me he thought a spirit was trying to warn him against making changes to the house. Another time, my ex was home alone with her dog watching TV downstairs when she suddenly heard loud, heavy footsteps walking down the hall upstairs. The footsteps were accompanied by banging on the walls, slowly moving toward the top of the staircase. Her dog bolted to the bottom of the stairs, barking furiously. She grabbed her phone and the dog and ran outside. From the sidewalk, she could see both entrances to the house, and the way the windows were set up, it would be impossible for someone to jump from the second story without seriously injuring themselves. The police searched the house but found no one. Her family chalked it up to a ghost. There were similar incidents too, like the attic door closing on its own, even with a chair placed in front of it. Something about that particular detail really unsettled me, and I refused to go up there. Anyway, my experience happened the first night we stayed there. We were settling down to sleep in the guest room, and I remember feeling slightly disturbed by the lighting. It was both too bright and too dim at the same time, casting an uncanny atmosphere. I figured I was just tired, so we climbed into bed and drifted off. I'm not sure if I was dreaming before it happened, but in the middle of the night, a woman appeared in my dream. She was violently angry and started speaking to me directly. She showed me images of the people I loved, my ex, family, friends, and then she started shoving broken glass into their gums, scraping it against their teeth. I was frozen, unable to react. She promised she would torture and kill everyone I cared about, insisting that everything she was saying was real. I tried to wake up, struggling against whatever hold she had on me. For a brief moment, I did wake up, only to find myself still in bed, surrounded by darkness. Then, somehow the woman from my dreams seemed to bleed into reality, screaming, "You will never escape." I bolted upright, screaming and shaking violently. My girlfriend woke up immediately, trying to calm me down and asking what had happened. I started crying as I recounted the dream, telling her how intensely real and messed up it felt. She reassured me it was just a dream, and eventually I managed to calm down. I was genuinely afraid to go back to sleep, but we somehow nodded off again and I made it to morning without further incident. We stayed in that room for a few more times over the years, but I never had another dream that intense again. You could probably chalk it up to the power of suggestion, being in a new place and being told the guest room was haunted, but that's the only time in my life I've ever had a true night terror, waking up screaming. I honestly don't know what to make of it. Maybe it was just my brain freaking out, but as a first-timer in that house, it felt like a warning. I was babysitting 3 kids who lived in an old farm outside a small village where I grew up. I was 17 at the time. It was a little past 11 p.m. and all the kids were asleep upstairs. The youngest kid was about 5 years old, for reference. I was sitting in the living room watching TV, and just to explain, there was a large opening on the wall. so from where I was sitting, I had a good view of the top of the stairs, but not the bottom half. I also couldn't see the entire kitchen, but I could see the fridge and part of the wall. So, as I said, I was watching TV when suddenly I heard footsteps on the stairs and I assumed it was one of the kids coming down. I looked, but no one was there. I could still hear the steps, so I figured they were in the part of the stairs that I couldn't see. Then I heard the footsteps heading toward the kitchen, but I didn't think much of it. About 30 seconds later, I heard the sound of a glass shattering. I jumped up and rushed to the kitchen, but when I got around the wall, the kitchen was empty. The glass was on the floor, broken, but no one was there. I had a full view of the only way back to the stairs, and I hadn't heard anyone go back up. Besides, it had only been about 10 seconds since the glass broke. I went upstairs to check on the kids, but they were fast asleep. I even went over to the youngest, convinced it had to be her and she was pretending. I asked if she was okay, reassuring her that I wasn't upset, but she was clearly sound asleep. Then I heard something downstairs again. Thinking the parents were home, I walked down and saw the front door wide open. I looked around, but there was no one there, and the parents' car was still gone. The front door had been locked this whole time, so it couldn't have opened on its own. At that point, I was terrified. I was certain someone had broken into the house. I grabbed a metal shoehorn for protection and searched the house, but as you might have guessed, I found no one. I turned on every light downstairs, then went back upstairs to sit outside the kids' rooms with my phone and the shoehorn in my hand. I was so scared, and I stayed there until their parents came home. This experience pops up in my head every once in a while, and I wanted to share it to see if anyone else had experienced anything similar. I'm a total skeptic when it comes to strange occurrences, but to this day, this event still gives me chills. A couple of years ago, I was still living at home with my parents. Our bedrooms were both upstairs, and this particular night my dad was working the night shift, so it was just my mom and me at home. We hung out together that evening and then went to our separate bedrooms for the night, she to hers and I to mine. My bed was positioned so that my head was as far from the door as possible, with my feet closest to it, so when I slept, I was facing the door. Around 2 a.m., I woke up lying flat on my back because I had the eerie feeling that someone was staring at me from my left side. I know it was around 2 a.m. because after this happened, I checked the clock and the entire event couldn't have lasted longer than a minute. I turned to my left and, clear as day, there was my mom standing beside me. I remember it vividly. She was wearing a white nightgown with little baby blue flowers, the same one she still wears to this day. She stood there as quiet as could be. I laughed, a bit startled, and said, "What the hell, you scared the F out of me. What do you want?" It's important to mention that my mom and I are best friends, so we always mess with each other. It wasn't unusual for us to have late night hangout sessions, so in my sleepy state, it seemed entirely plausible that she had come over to wake me up for a snack or something. But she didn't say a word, not a peep, no movement, nothing. I said something like, "Come on, what the hell?" thinking she was just messing with me and would start laughing any second, but still, nothing. At that point, I started to worry, thinking maybe something was wrong, like she was sick or something terrible had happened to a family member and she didn't know how to tell me. Again, I asked, "Mom, what is it?" As I said that, I used my left elbow, the one closest to her, to push myself up into a sitting position and begin to turn to face her. One more time, I said, "Mom?" And as I reached out to touch her shoulder, my entire body slumped forward over the bed. She had completely vanished. Just like that, she wasn't there. I almost crapped my pants. I jumped up so fast, thinking either I had completely lost it or she had really pulled one over on me. I threw on the light and darted across the hall to her room where she was sleeping peacefully with her breathing machine. I woke her up to ask about it, only to be met with confusion and mild annoyance for disturbing her sleep. I absolutely did not sleep the rest of the night. used to own a secondhand store in Pennacook, New Hampshire, and I would bring my sweet white lab mix with me to work. She loved everyone. Occasionally, I would take in consignments. One day, an elderly gentleman came into the store and asked if I would be interested in an antique spinning wheel that his deceased wife had bought years ago at an auction. The auction was held in a warehouse in town that was being renovated. I agreed to take it. About a week later, he returned with the spinning wheel and set it up on the front of the store, where it was visible from the large windows. My store was located in a mini mall, sandwiched between a Subway and a hairdresser, so there was a lot of foot traffic passing by day and night until Subway closed. A few weeks later, I unlocked the store one morning and walked in to turn off the alarm. My dog followed me in and stopped in front of the spinning wheel, tilting her head from side to side as she stared at it. Then she wagged her tail. I watched her curiously. Suddenly, the spinning wheel started to move. At first, I didn't think much of it, assuming it was just the wind from the door. I called my dog to the back room and went about my day. Later that afternoon, one of the employees from Subway came into my store. I knew her from ordering subs, and we often waved at each other when she was on duty. She asked if I had left the AC on the night before, which I hadn't, so there shouldn't have been any air circulation in the store. Curious, I asked her why she was asking. She explained that a customer had come in and asked if my store was haunted. Apparently, the customer saw a lady sitting at the spinning wheel, which was moving as if it were spinning yarn. The Subway employee just chuckled as she told me this, saying she didn't want to be late for her shift and left. I chuckled too, thinking it wasn't surprising considering my store was filled with pre-owned items. Time passed and I completely forgot about the conversation until the next morning. I went into the store as usual, and once again, my dog stopped at the spinning wheel and the wheel started spinning. It was oddly comforting to think that a woman might still be attached to her beloved spinning wheel, but that comfort didn't last long. I had a busy week buying new items for the store and rearranging the displays. One night after my son fell asleep, I went back to the store to finish some paperwork. Both of the neighboring stores were closed and my car was the only one in the parking lot. As I walked through the door on the loading dock, I heard what sounded like a room full of people chatting and laughing. I crept into the showroom and the noise abruptly stopped. I dismissed it, thinking it might have been someone at the hairdresser or Subway, and proceeded to my office. The evening security lights provided enough illumination, so I didn't turn on the full lights in the store. As I sat at my desk and began pulling out files, I heard the noises again. My office had a view of the showroom, but there was no one there. The sounds grew louder, filling the space around me. It was as if the different entities attached to the second-hand items were having a lively party. It was more amusing than frightening, to be honest. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door, and the commotion stopped. It was a friend delivering a desk I had purchased from a flea market a few days earlier. We moved a few things around, found the perfect spot for the desk, and paired it with an old repurposed chair I had picked up at a garage sale a few months back. After walking my friend out and chatting by his truck about an upcoming flea market, I returned to the store. The place felt eerily quiet when I reached the desk, and I noticed the chair was not in the same position. I thought I might have forgotten to place it there, so I put it back and headed to my office. No sooner had I sat down when I heard something fall. Rushing back to the showroom, I found the chair knocked over and a bit away from the desk. Then, I heard what sounded like an argument taking place. A low murmur at first, but it gradually grew louder. I couldn't make out the words, but it was definitely two male voices. As I bent down to pick up the chair, the roll top of the desk suddenly slammed shut, leaving me in shock. Trying to stay calm, I put the chair back in its place and retreated to the back room. I found another chair and, feeling a bit ridiculous, I asked it nicely if it would mind being paired with the desk. Hoping for the best, I returned to the desk and gently asked it if this chair would be a suitable match. Nothing happened, so I slowly placed the chair by the desk and backed away. Still nothing. Deciding it was too late to deal with any more surprises, I left the store for the night. That experience changed how I approached pairing items in my store. When I was 7 or 8 years old, my brother and I, along with some neighborhood kids, were playing hide and seek. It was my turn to seek, so I went inside the house to cover my eyes and count to 100. Since no one could see me, I decided to cheat. I went upstairs and started peeking out the windows to see where everyone was hiding. When I got to my older brother's room to look out the window, I had just finished counting to 100, so I needed to get back downstairs quickly. I glanced out the window, then turned to leave, but before I could take 2 steps, the bedroom door slammed shut, startling me. I felt an eerie compulsion to look at the attic door, which happened to be in that room. I heard something moving inside the attic, and fear washed over me. That attic had always terrified me because of other experiences I had involving it. I backed up until my back was pressed against the wall farthest from both doors. I felt trapped because I didn't want to go near the door that had just slammed shut on me, but it was the only exit. Then, I heard a loud growl from inside the attic. My heart felt like it stopped, and my chest tightened in fear. It's hard to describe the sheer terror I felt. I wanted to scream, but I was too terrified to make a sound. I just stood there, frozen, waiting for whatever was in the attic to come for me. Fortunately, within a few seconds, my brother opened the door and started yelling at me for being in his room. I bolted past him and ran straight outside. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. They wouldn't have believed me anyway. That was the first time I heard that growl in the house, but it wouldn't be the last. About a year later, I was in the upstairs bathroom when I heard the growl again. It terrified me and I rushed downstairs. As I hurried down, I heard the growl a second time, this time coming from inside my parents' bedroom. I stopped and peeked in, and when I saw my dad asleep in bed, I felt instant relief knowing I wasn't alone upstairs. But then the growl happened again, and I realized it was just my dad snoring. I felt so relieved and a little silly for being scared in the first place. I even wondered if that's what I had heard the first time from the attic, but there was still no explanation for the door slamming shut by itself. A few years later, I went into the upstairs bathroom without fear. It had been a while since anything strange had happened, so I was no longer scared to go upstairs alone. While I was in there, I heard the growl again. I was a little spooked, but I figured it was just my dad snoring, so I finished up and headed for the stairs. Just to confirm, I glanced into his bedroom on my way down, but he wasn't there this time. I was alone upstairs. That familiar, overwhelming terror gripped me again, and I ran downstairs as fast as I could. Fortunately, we ended up moving out of that house not long after.